Hey guys, I'm sorry that I couldn't be there today, but we are going to be looking at the causes of the Civil War. This is after the presidency of Andrew Jackson. So we've seen since the first colonies that we have totally different economies going on in the South and in the North, how they made money. So in the North, we made money based on industry or making stuff in factories. The South made money mostly through agriculture. So manufacturing is making stuff in factories. That's what's going on in the North because they didn't have good farmland. And in the South, where they did have great farmland, we had an agricultural economy, growing cash crops where slavery was used for the main source of labor. Our big cash crops at this time are cotton and tobacco. Off in the Appalachian area, we had subsistence farmers. Remember, these are our poorer folks who don't have big plantations, but still make money, or I'm sorry, don't make money, still feed their families by growing their own crops. So when we talk about manufacturing in the North, we're talking about making things like textiles, cloth, iron, shipbuilding in New England, trading those goods back to Europe. And in the South, pretty much all of the money made through cotton at this point. 80% of the cotton in the world at this time is made in the southern states in the United States, but we have other cash crops like rice, tobacco, and indigo. So you just did a reading on tariffs, but tariffs were something that really protected the North because it was like an extra tax on goods coming from outside of the country. So that meant that goods that were made here were cheaper because they weren't tariffed and they weren't taxed. So the North really liked the tariff because it protected the stuff that they were making. It made their stuff cheaper to sell in the U.S. than foreign stuff, so there was less European competition. But the South did not appreciate tariffs because it made goods from Europe too expensive, so it forced them to buy stuff from the North. They didn't really have a choice because the stuff from Europe was more expensive after it was placed with a tariff on the way in from Europe. So this drove up the price that people in the South had to pay for goods since they were dependent on goods from the North only. So the tensions over this tariff became so strong that the South actually threatened to leave the country if the North didn't lower the tariffs. They were so frustrated with having to only buy goods from the North that they said that they were willing to start their own country so that they wouldn't have to pay these tariffs. So South Carolina started this kind of big drama and said that the tariff laws were null in their state. So they basically said, we're not going to follow this federal law, which was crazy because, as we learned, federal law is supreme to state laws. But the country was in such a state at this point that they ended up compromising, and the North agreed to lower the tariffs so that South Carolina wouldn't leave the country and so that the South would stay a part of the U.S. This only worked for a little while, but it did keep things at bay. So some of our social causes of the Civil War are slavery. So those were economic causes, North and the South arguing about money. This is going to be a social cause. So as we were expanding westward, there was always a conflict when we added new land about whether slavery would be legal there or not. The North didn't want any more slave states. The South did. So abolitionists were a group of people who were fighting to end slavery. So they are rallying for all new states to make slavery illegal, while Southerners are fighting for slavery. These people want to move out west, get more land, grow more cash crops, and they need slaves to do that. So we're seeing a big divide, a big conflict between North and South over the issue of slavery. So you can see this new area that was purchased with the Louisiana Purchase has become a primarily agricultural area since it's warm and conducive to farming. So we're seeing a lot of cotton production in that area. Texas, which was annexed and taken from Mexico, also producing a lot of cotton. And both of those states are using slave labor. So you can see in 1820, the huge difference that takes place in the production of cotton. This red area is all where cotton is being produced. The invention of that cotton gin made a huge difference in that. We learned about that earlier, that machine that automatically cleaned the cotton. So slaves were used to pick cotton, and then the cotton gin cleaned the cotton very fast. So we're seeing a huge boom in the production and sale of cotton in the South. And with that, an increase in the slave owning population. So you can see here, folks who owned slaves typically owned a lot of slaves. It was a minority that owned just a few. When we look at the majority of slave owners, we're seeing hundreds and thousands of slaves in ownership. So we do start to see some fights back against slavery. Abolitionists were those folks in the North who fought against slavery. We'll learn about them next class. But there were some slave rebellions that started to take place in the South, starting with Gabriel Prosser, who was a slave from Virginia who planned to rebel against not only his owner, but other plantation owners. So he was going to try to get a group of slaves to revolt. And then Nat Turner, another slave from Virginia, also planned to revolt and actually did. So we'll talk about them for a second here. So Gabriel Prosser was actually turned in by other slaves when he was talking and planning this rebellion. There was a reward for information about slaves who were planning to revolt, and other slaves actually turned him in, and he was killed. But we do start to see slaves starting to fight for their freedom. Nat Turner did something similar. He actually went through with his rebellion, gathered a group of slaves, attacked 4 different plantations in Virginia, killed a lot of the white plantation owners. He was eventually, though, captured by police and killed. But slaves were definitely encouraged by these 2 slaves who had rebelled. And so we see a law put into place after these rebellions called the Fugitive Slave Law, which made it illegal for anyone who had run away from slavery to do so, and you would immediately be arrested and returned to your owner. So even if slaves were able to escape and run away to the North, this was a federal law. So many free slaves were actually arrested and put back into slavery, and a lot of African American black men in the North who had never been slaves were captured by mistake, just because this was such a wild time that they were put back into slavery, even if they were free men to begin with. So the Fugitive Slave Act made the North actually participate in slavery, because it was the law that if you saw a slave or someone you suspected to be an escaped slave, that you turned that person in to police, and there was a reward for that. So the Fugitive Slave Act made African Americans not only very unsafe in the South, but also in the North. So we'll continue to talk about abolitionists next class. But just to review for today, we see the economic differences between manufacturing and agriculture that's really divided the country. The South very dependent on slave labor, which causes a lot of tension between people in the North who don't agree with slavery, as well as slaves themselves trying to revolt against the institution of slavery. So we'll continue next class with some of the abolitionist movement. You're going to do a reading now that looks a little more deeply into the fight against slavery.